The noose was around her neck by noon, and not one soul dared move, until what he did next stopped everything cold. Nobody in Cimarron, New Mexico territory had seen this drifter before. He'd ridden in from the south road at a slow walk, the gray horse raising a small cloud of red dust, his duster so thoroughly sun-faded, it had stopped having a color of its own. He pulled up at the edge of the crowd gathered around the cottonwood scaffold at the east edge of town, looked at the widow standing on the platform with her hands bound and a rope near her neck, and nobody could have guessed from looking at him, that they were watching the most feared gunslinger alive in the territory ride in and introduce himself. Her name was Ruth Calloway. It was October of 1883, in the hard country east of Cimarron, where the land was red and flat and the horizon looked like something drawn with a long straight edge. She was 29 years old. She had not killed her husband, and she was approximately 30 seconds from being hanged for it. If you're just finding this channel tonight, partner, hit subscribe and ring the bell so you don't miss a single story. And tell me, where are you watching from? What time is it where you are? Drop it in the comments below. I read every one. Now, let's go back to the beginning. Let's go back to how a widow ends up on a scaffold in a town that should have known better. Ruth Calloway came to Cimarron in the spring of 1881 as a bride. She was 26 then, with copper-colored hair and a steady, precise kind of gaze that strangers sometimes mistook for coldness until they spent 5 minutes with her and realized it was just focus. She didn't waste her attention on things that didn't deserve it. She had come west from St. Louis with her husband, Daniel Calloway, a quiet and methodical man who had saved for 4 years to purchase a homestead of 412 acres along the fork of the Cimarron River. The land was exceptional. Good grass for cattle, water, year-round from the fork, a gentle south-facing slope that caught the morning sun so well that the first summer's planting came in ahead of schedule. Daniel built the house himself over 2 months, plank by plank, and Ruth worked alongside him on everything that didn't require a second man on a crosscut saw, and on some things that did. By the end of their first year, they had a working farm, a small herd, a root cellar that was better stocked than most in the county, and the beginnings of a life that felt like it had been earned. The trouble was that someone else had decided that life was worth taking. His name was Elias Cutter, and in Cimarron in 1883, that name was a kind of geography. Cutter owned the grain mill, the livery stable, one of the 2 saloons on the main street, and 2,000 acres of grazing land to the north of town. He also held, through accumulated mechanisms of debt and quiet pressure and carefully timed generosity, a reasonable portion of the county sheriff's loyalty and most of the town council's cooperation. He was 51 years old. Broad-chested, fond of beaver felt hats, fond of the sound of his own voice. He had a gift for making a threat sound like sound business advice. He had been after the Calloway property for nearly a year before things turned ugly. He began with an offer. Daniel turned it down politely. Cutter raised the offer by 1/3. Daniel turned that down too, also politely, and wrote a letter to the county land office saying he wished to note for the record that he had declined all purchase offers for his homestead and intended to continue doing so, because a man who does that kind of thing has usually had some experience with what follows. What followed was this. First, an additional tax assessment arrived, delivered by a deputy named Hicks, who kept his eyes on the ground throughout the entire transaction and left as quickly as the mud on the road permitted. Daniel paid it. Then, a water rights claim he had filed with the Territorial Land Office was rejected due to a paperwork deficiency, a deficiency that had apparently materialized sometime between filing and review, because the clerk Daniel had dealt with originally had no record of any such problem. Resubmission required new fees and a 3-month wait. Daniel paid that too, and resubmitted. Then his hired hand started leaving. 2. In the space of a week, both of them tight-lipped about the reasons, both of them suddenly employed in other arrangements that they didn't care to discuss. Daniel was left working the acreage alone, which was possible but punishing, and the following month the water rights appeal was denied a second time on grounds that were so opaque. Daniel's lawyer in Taos wrote back to say he had read the rejection letter 4 times. By the summer of 1883, Daniel Calloway was working alone, carrying debt from the legal fees, and sleeping badly. Ruth watched her husband, aged 6 years and 18 months. She ground her own teeth and held the household together and kept the garden and the root cellar and the herd in order, because the land was theirs and they had built it, and she did not have the disposition to retreat. Daniel went to Sheriff Amos Pruitt twice about the harassment. Both times he came out of the office with the clear impression that Pruitt was busy with other concerns and also very invested in his continued employment, which was funded substantially. Pruitt was not, to give him the minimum of credit that honesty requires, a deeply wicked man. He was a frightened one, which in practice tends to produce the same results. In late September, on a night when Ruth finally fell into a sleep deep enough that she didn't hear anything at all, Daniel Calloway walked down to the creek bank in the dark. She found him there at first light. The shot had been at close range, angled downward. He had been on his knees, or the shooter had been above him on the bank. His pockets were empty. The watch that had belonged to his father, gone. And the folded deed to the property that he kept on his person, out of habit, always, because he was a careful man, and careful men keep their important papers close, that was gone too. The creek had washed his boots and the lower half of his coat. Ruth knelt in the cold water beside him and held his hand until the sun was fully up, and she did not cry because crying felt like a concession she wasn't ready to make and might not be able to stop. By the time she reached the sheriff's office, someone had already been there ahead of her. The story Pruitt told her, with considerable difficulty and almost no eye contact, was this. A witness had come forward before sunrise, reporting that he had heard a quarrel between Daniel and Ruth Calloway the previous evening. This witness's name was Tom Reeves. He worked for Elias Cutter 3 days a week as a fence builder, and he had not been anywhere within earshot of the Calloway property the previous night, and Ruth knew it, and Amos Pruitt probably knew it too. But knowing and saying were 2 very different things when Halford Sims was already in town. Sims was Cutter's attorney, arrived from Santa Fe the day before, which meant Cutter had known something was going to happen before it happened, which was a thing Ruth filed away with precision. Sims was a trim man in a good coat who had the practiced ease of someone accustomed to making bad situations look orderly. He had already drafted a motion at the land office by the time Ruth arrived at the sheriff's desk. They arrested her that afternoon. She spent 4 days in the jail cell at the end of the sheriff's hallway, listening through the plank wall. She heard more than anyone intended her to hear. She heard Sims and Pruitt discussing the trial schedule. She heard the name of the judge who would preside, a man named Baxter, riding in from Rayton. She heard on the third morning Halford Sims having a conversation in the hallway, at a volume that she understood was not accidental, about the motion for property transfer at the land office. She spent those 4 days building a complete and precise inventory of everything she knew and everything she could prove and everything she would need. And when they brought her out for the trial on the 5th morning, she was as ready as a person can be for a proceeding that has already been decided. The trial lasted 3 hours. Judge Baxter had ridden in from Rayton and was scheduled to ride back out the same afternoon. 12 men in the jury box, 9 of them familiar to Ruth, 7 of them in Cutter's pocket or his debt. Tom Reeves took the stand and described what he claimed to have witnessed, and Ruth watched his face carefully and saw the way his eyes moved to the upper left when he stated his location the previous night, which is what a person's eyes do when they are constructing rather than remembering. Sims conducted the prosecution with professional efficiency. The defense attorney, a young man named Pettifer who had been appointed rather than chosen, did his competent best with the materials available to him, which were thin. The jury deliberated for 20 minutes. Ruth stood in the dock and looked at each face and said nothing and was steady. When the verdict came, she looked at Elias Cutter, sitting in the second row behind the prosecution table with his hands folded on the head of his walking stick, and she held that look until he shifted his gaze to the far wall of the courtroom. That was the only small victory available to her. The hanging was set for the following Tuesday. They took her laces when they locked her back up. They had already taken her belt. When they walked her out on Tuesday morning, hands bound in front of her, dress 4 days unwashed, the unlaced boots loose around her ankles, the cold October wind hit her face, and the main street of Cimarron stretched ahead of her, and the cottonwood scaffold stood at the east end of it. She thought about the south slope of their property, and the way the morning sun came across it. She thought about the root cellar, and the winter supply she had put up, and what would happen to it. She did not think about crying. There was no room for it. She climbed the steps to the platform without assistance. She stood on the boards and looked out at the gathered crowd, perhaps 60 people. Men, mostly. Most of them were looking at the ground. A few watched openly in the way that people watch disasters they cannot stop, because the inability to look away is a form of helplessness too. Near the edge of the crowd, Elias Cutter stood with his lawyer and 2 of his hired men. He was not looking at the ground. Ruth looked at him until he looked away. Then she heard the hoofbeats. From the south road, slow and unhurried, a single horse. The rhythm of it was so settled, so utterly without urgency, that several people in the crowd turned to look simply because there was something strange about the pace in the context of what was happening. He came in against the angle of the morning sun, a shape at first a man on a gray horse, wide-brimmed hat pulled low, a duster that had the color bleached out of it by long road use. He moved at a walk the way a man comes when he has formed no opinion about whether people notice him. He stopped at the edge of the crowd. He looked at the scaffold. His gaze moved from the platform to the rope looped over the crossbeam of the cottonwood frame, to Ruth standing on the boards, to the deputy at the far end of the platform. A young man named George Finney, who was gripping the handle of the drop lever and looking like he wished, very much, that Tuesday had not arrived as quickly as it had. Nobody spoke. The stranger looked at George Finney. Then, low and flat, and carrying in the cold air with a particular quality of something measured and final, he said 2 words: "Cut the rope." Not a demand with the heat of anger behind it. Something else, a statement precise as a compass bearing, carrying the clear and specific quality of a man who has issued instructions like this before and has formed accurate expectations about whether they are obeyed. George Finney looked at the rope. He looked at the man on the gray horse. He looked at Elias Cutter. Cutter stepped forward from the crowd's edge. He was not a coward, which was one of the things that made him dangerous, and his voice was steady when he said, loud enough to carry, that this was a lawful execution of a lawful sentence and the stranger would do well to ride on. The stranger turned his head. He looked at Cutter the way a man looks at arithmetic. He has already worked out. That verdict came from a purchased court, he said. Your witness was lying, your judge came in on a hired horse. He looked at Cutter. You have about 30 seconds to tell your man to cut that rope before this becomes something a lawyer can't fix. Who in the hell are you? The question went unanswered. 30 seconds passed in the cold October air, an extraordinary half-minute in which Cimarron stood absolutely still, and then George Finney, making the most consequential independent decision of his career. The crowd exhaled. Ruth stepped back from the drop, her legs held. She put one hand on the platform post and steadied herself and looked at the man on the gray horse. He had dismounted. He was coming through the crowd, which opened for him in the particular way crowds open for things they don't understand but have correctly identified as requiring clearance. And he came to the base of the scaffold steps and looked up at her. Come down, he said. You have a horse? She looked at the spotted mare being held at the crowd's edge by one of Cutter's men, Daisy, her own horse, taken from the property. The man holding Daisy's reins let go of them. Behind Cutter, one of his hired men moved his hand toward his hip. The stranger turned around. He didn't draw his own weapon. He simply turned and let the hired man see his face, and whatever the hired man saw, there was sufficient to stop the hand from completing its journey. Cutter's voice had dropped below the level of the crowd. This is interference with lawful. It's interference with a murder. The stranger looked up at Ruth. Ride north, I'll follow. Ruth. Calloway had spent 4 days in a cell thinking through what she was willing to do when the moment came. She had stood on a platform with a rope near her neck and held herself steady. She was not a woman who required other people to settle her circumstances for her. She walked down the scaffold steps, took Daisy's reins, looked once at Elias Cutter, the way she had looked at him across the courtroom, and rode north at a canter. The stranger mounted the gray horse and came behind her at a walk, unhurried as always, as though there were nothing behind him and nothing at risk, and 60 people stood in the cold October wind and watched them go, and not one of them moved. They rode for the better part of an hour without speaking. Ruth was not silent from shock. She had processed too much in the last 4 days to be capable of simple shock. She was silent because she was thinking through the logistics of what came next, who she could trust, what she had, what Cutter would do now, what the man riding 50 yards behind her intended to do once they stopped. She had learned in the past week that assumptions cost you, and she was not making any she hadn't tested. She turned in the saddle after the town had dropped below the red horizon behind them. The stranger was riding at the same distance, the same pace, watching the road ahead, the tree lines, the angles. She had been watching him do that since he came through the crowd in town, and she was fairly certain he had not stopped doing it at any point. You could have been killed back there, she said, when he had pulled up even with her. He looked at the road. Could have. Were you not concerned about that? Not particularly. She studied him. 40 or so, she thought, lines in the face from weather and something else, not smiling. His hands on the reins were relaxed and still. The rifle in the saddle, scabbard on his left, was old, but maintained. The revolver on his right hip sat in its holster, with the ease of something that had been there long enough to become part of the landscape. "Who are you?" He was quiet for long enough that she started to think the question would go the way of Cutter's question, and also remain unanswered. "Folks call me Cade." "Is that your name?" "It's what they call me." She accepted that. Another quarter-mile under their horses' hooves, a hawk turned slow circles over something in the dry grass to the east. "Where are we going?" "You have people anywhere out of Cutter's reach for tonight?" Ruth thought through the options she'd already assembled. The Hendersons were 8 miles north, good people, kind people, and she was not going to bring Cutter's attention to their door. Her brother in Kansas City was 4 days' hard ride in the wrong direction, and didn't know any of this had happened. Her nearest friendly contact, with any standing, was a woman in Springer who had known Daniel, but Springer was farther than tonight allowed. "There's a line cabin on the north end of my property. Cutter's men won't come near it in daylight. It sits high enough to be visible from the road. Not at night, though, not at night." He nodded. "Show me the way." The cabin was a single-room, double-log construction, solidly made by the previous owner of the property. Daniel had kept it stocked with dry goods and ammunition against the possibility of a hard winter cutting them off from town, which was a possibility that arrived reliably in this part of New Mexico. The wood supply was adequate. The water barrel was 3/4 full. There was a rifle on the peg beside the door, Daniel's hunting rifle, a lever-action .30 caliber that Ruth had shot accurately since the summer they arrived. She built the fire. He walked the perimeter in the last of the daylight, looking at the approaches to the cabin, the road from the south, the tree line 40 yards behind, the dry creek bed to the east that ran between low-cut banks and could provide cover for a man coming in quietly. When he came back inside, she poured coffee into a tin cup and handed it to him across the fire, without being asked, because it was cold and she had coffee and it was the obvious thing to do. He sat across from her and drank it. She looked at him in the firelight. The watchfulness had not left his face. "You knew Cutter was behind Daniel's death before you rode into town. I knew you hadn't shot your husband, Hal." He looked at her. "Shot from behind at that range, there'd have been powder burn on your hands. The sheriff's report didn't mention it. Pruitt left that detail out because he was told to, or because it didn't serve the story he'd been given. You read the sheriff's report. Before you came in, before I rode in," he agreed. The fire settled between them with a dry click. A log shifted. "You were already coming. Before you arrived today, this wasn't chance." He set the cup down. "I heard there was a widow being hanged in Cimarron for a killing she didn't do, and I knew whose land she was being hanged for." He looked at the fire. "Elias Cutter and I have a prior history, 3 years ago in Tucson. He arranged the killing of a freight operator there, a man named Martin Greer, who was a friend of mine. Cutter hired 2 men to do it. I was in Tucson when it happened." Ruth thought through the implication of what he wasn't saying about those 2 men. "You've been carrying something against Cutter since then. Evidence. Affidavits, the money trail between Cutter and the men he paid. It's been in safe keeping, waiting for the right legal situation. And this is the right legal situation. Your situation gives mine traction. That opens doors that Cutter's arrangement with local officials can't close. Ruth absorbed this. The fire between them gave off a pulse of amber light, and the cabin walls were solid against the rising wind outside. She thought about what kind of man spends 3 years building a case in patience and rides across a territory on a rumor about a widow being hanged for something she didn't do. She thought about Daniel. The deed to my property is missing. Daniel always carried the original. It was gone when I found him. If he files a false transfer at the land office, and Halford Sims already started that process, I can't fight it without the original or a certified copy. He was listening carefully. Daniel had a contact at Cutter's mill. Before things got bad, this man told him that Cutter keeps his land acquisition files in the back room. Every property he's taken, or is working to take, deeds, notes, transfer documents. How many men does Cutter keep at the mill overnight? 2 ordinarily, maybe 3 if he's worried. And tonight, he'll be worried tonight. He stood up. He took his hat from the peg and settled it on his head. Stay here. Door bolted. 2 knocks, a pause, 1 more. That's me. She looked at him standing there in the firelight, hat on, composed for whatever came next, already somewhere ahead of her. In his thinking, Cade. She held his gaze. I want to know before tonight. He stood quiet for a moment. Not defensively, with the patience of someone who has been in enough situations to have thought carefully about what they amount to. The kind, he said, that Elias Cutter should have left alone. He went out. She bolted the door. The night was long. She didn't sleep. She sat with Daniel's hunting rifle across her knees near the cooling fire, and she listened to the October dark outside the cabin walls. An owl worked the tree line once, methodically. A coyote somewhere far to the north gave the night 2 short notes, and then went quiet. The fire burned down to coals, and she let it because dark windows from outside were better than lit ones. She thought about the south slope of their land, and the spring she'd found in her second summer, there a small seep under a flat rock that nobody had noticed before, and how pleased Daniel had been when she showed him, how he had gotten down on his knees and tested the water. Around 2 in the morning she heard hoofbeats, 3 horses, moving fast, heading south toward Cimarron. Then silence for a long time. At 3:45 she heard 2 knocks, a pause, and 1 more. She opened the door. He stood there with a tin box under his arm and a cloth wrapped around his left hand. He walked past her into the cabin, set the box on the table, and sat down in the chair across from it. The cut on his hand was recent. They had 4 men, he said. Not 3. How bad is the hand? Fine. He opened the tin box. Ruth reached in and found the deed. Original, certified, notarized in Cimarron on the 14th day of April, 1881. Daniel's handwriting. Both their names. She held it for a long time without saying anything, because there was nothing adequate to say about holding the thing that your husband died for. 3 of Cutter's men had ridden for town when they understood what was happening at the main house. The 4th had a twisted ankle from the porch steps. Nobody was dead. He described this in brief, plain sentences, and she thought, looking at him, that the absence of casualties was deliberate, not fortunate. A professional choice made in the dark by a man who was thinking several steps ahead about federal investigations and the quality of evidence. She got the first aid tin and cleaned the cut on his hand. He sat still for it. When she sat back down, the words came out in a rush, the careful inventory she'd been keeping. We have the deed. Cutter still has Lindell and Fitch and a sheriff who'll do what he's told. He'll send men here in the morning. Yes, the deed is legal, but the legal machinery here is Cutter's machinery. The land office will stall. Pruitt will claim I escaped lawful custody. He looked at her steadily. There's a U.S. Marshal's office in Santa Fe. Federal jurisdiction for land fraud supersedes the county. You write a letter tonight, everything. The rigged trial, Tom Reeves's perjury, the deed, Daniel's murder, the names, Doak, Lindell, Burl Fitch, Halford Sims. The judge's connection to Cutter, I'll get it to Santa Fe. It takes time for the marshal's office to respond. In the meantime, Cutter needs to believe that whatever he does next will cost him considerably more than he bargained for. And, he paused, I have a rider I trust, good horse. The letter can leave tonight. Ruth stared at him. You already arranged a rider? Before I fell asleep? Before. She took that in. The fire was cold coals now, and the cabin was dark, except for the lamp on the table, and she sat in the half-light across from this man, who had planned 4 moves ahead of a situation that had begun for her that morning as a hanging. You have a plan for tomorrow, too. Not quite a question. Outline of one. Depends on who Cutter sends and how many. He looked at her. Tell me everything you know about Doak Lindell, she told him. Doak Lindell had been working for Elias Cutter for 6 years. He was tall and thin-faced and had the stillness of a predator when he stood still, which was the only way Ruth knew to describe it, a quality of conserving rather than resting, as though every moment of apparent quiet was actually preparation. He did the things that Cutter needed done without paperwork. Before Cimarron, there had been trouble in Taos involving a rancher named Beckett who had been fighting Cutter over a grazing lease. Beckett had eventually left the territory. Nobody local said Lindell's name in connection with that departure, but nobody who knew the county believed the departure was entirely voluntary. 2 people had told Ruth in the hours after Daniel's death that they had seen Lindell on the road near the creek the previous evening. Both of them had refused to say this to anyone official. She understood that refusal. She didn't blame them for it. Burl Fitch was different, shorter, broader, the kind of man who talked too much and thought too little, useful for visible intimidation and not much more. Lindell was the point of the knife. The rest were handle. Cade listened to all of it without interrupting. When she was finished, he was quiet for a moment, looking at the cold lamp flame. Write the letter, then sleep a few hours. I'll watch. Ruth looked at him across the table. This man who had ridden into a hanging and spent the rest of the night retrieving a tin box from a guarded property and was now offering to sit up so she could sleep for 3 hours. She wrote the letter first. It took 2 hours. She wrote it the way she did everything she considered important, precisely, chronologically, naming every person and every date, quoting what she had heard through the wall of the jail cell, describing the wound angle that the sheriff's report had omitted, citing the land office motion that Sims had already filed. When it was done, it was 4 pages in a clear, firm hand that she thought no reasonable person could dismiss. Cade read it. He corrected 1 date. He folded it and sealed it inside his coat, and 15 minutes later she heard him speaking briefly to someone at the door. A voice she didn't know, low, an exchange of perhaps 30 words, and then the sound of a horse moving south at a canter into the dark. She lay down on the cot with Daniel's rifle alongside her. She was asleep in minutes and did not dream. She woke to gray light and the smell of wood smoke and fresh coffee. He was outside. She could hear him moving around the perimeter of the clearing with that quiet purposefulness she was already beginning to recognize. She got up and went to the door. The morning was cold and still, the sky the color of iron and the grass silver-white with frost. He was standing at the eastern edge of the clearing, crouched, looking at something in the frost. Someone came to the edge of the clearing in the night, turned back, 3 horses, reconnoitering. They'll come in force before midday. He stood and came back toward the cabin, looking at it the way he looked at everything, measuring angles and distances, making calculations. Can you shoot that rifle, or is it on the peg for comfort? Daniel taught me the summer we arrived. I've kept the practice. Ruth looked at the rifle. I haven't missed a moving target since the spring of 1882. He looked at her. That near expression again, acknowledgement rather than surprise. He nodded once and went back to work. They spent the morning on practical things. He walked every approach with her, the south road. He cut 2 firing positions through the brush on the eastern perimeter, where the tree line provided cover and a clear angle to the road. He checked every window for visibility and sight lines. He looked at the wood supply and the water and pronounced both adequate. He sent her for additional water while he worked on the eastern position, and when she returned he was satisfied. Over jerky and hardtack from the cabin's stores, while the October sun climbed to mid-morning, Ruth set the hardtack down and looked at him. Doak, Lindell, will be with them when they come. He was quiet. She had been thinking through how to say the next part since before dawn, and had decided the direct way was the only one that served. I am not asking you to commit a crime on my behalf. I want that clearly said. If Doak Lindell comes to this land with the intention of finishing what he started against my husband, I want to be the one who addresses that. He held her gaze for a long, considered moment. All right, they came at 11 in the morning. 5 riders, South Road, canter. Cade was at the eastern tree line and saw them first. Came back to the cabin at a steady walk, held up 5 fingers. He held up 5 fingers. Lindell's in front. Gray hat, you'll know him. She checked the rifle and took her position at the east window, behind the frame where she was not visible from the road. He went out to the porch. The 5 riders pulled up when they saw him standing there. Doak Lindell in the center, tall, thin-faced, gray hat, that particular quality of coiled stillness. Burl Fitch on his right with a red bandana. 3 men Ruth didn't know, probably hired since the warrant trouble she'd overheard. Lindell looked at Cade for a measuring moment. This is Cutter property. You're trespassing. The deed is with the rightful owner. The land office motion was based on perjured testimony. Lindell scanned the cabin looking for Ruth, didn't find her. His eyes came back to Cade. Who are you? I'm the man asking you once to turn those horses around. Something moved across Lindell's face, not quite recognition, but approaching it. The shadow of a description heard somewhere matching a shape he was now looking at. You cut her down in town yesterday. Ruth's rifle cracked clean in the cold morning air. The shot took the gray hat off his head an inch from his skull, deliberate as a signature. His hand froze on the way to his hip. The hat settled in the dust of the road. The 4 men behind him went absolutely still. Ruth stepped through the cabin door onto the porch, rifle level, another round already chambered. Lindell turned and looked at her. Whatever had been in his face before, a new calculation had replaced it. He understood what that shot had been. He understood what the one after it would be. "You killed my husband." Her voice was even as a table. "You shot him in the back at the creek bed. You took his watch and his deed and whatever cash he carried. And you rode Tom Reeves to the sheriff's office before sunup to put your name and whereabouts somewhere else in the record." She watched his face. "Two people saw you on the road that night. They were afraid to say it officially." "I am not afraid." Lindell said nothing. His jaw was tight. "Raise your hands." He looked at Cade. Cade stood relaxed on the porch beside Ruth, hands at his sides, face showing nothing at all. The patience of a man with no particular stake in Lindell's next decision, which was, if you thought about it, probably the most frightening thing Lindell had ever seen on a porch. Lindell raised his hands. Behind him, Burl Fitch and the three hired men sat their horses without moving and without drawing. The calculation, run individually by 5 different minds, had reached the same unanimous conclusion. This was not a situation where aggression led anywhere good. "You're going to ride toward Santa Fe," Ruth said, "not to surrender. To understand. In 3 days, this property is under federal jurisdiction for the duration of a land fraud and murder investigation. The next time any of you come to this land without my permission." She looked at each of the 5 men in turn. "The U.S. Marshal already has my statement. He has the names, all of them." Lindell lowered his hands slowly. He reached down and picked up his hat from the road. He looked at Ruth for a long time with a face she couldn't entirely read. Not defeat exactly, but something in the same county as it. Lindell's jaw worked. He bent and retrieved the gray hat from the road, turning it over in his hands. "Your husband wasn't a fighter. It was aimed as contempt and landed differently." Ruth kept the rifle level. "He wasn't. He was the best farmer I have ever known, and he built something worth having. And you killed him for land that isn't yours. Go." They went. She stood on the porch and watched until the sound of their horses was gone below the south horizon. Then she set the rifle against the wall and sat down on the steps and put her face in her hands. Not because she was falling apart, she wasn't, and she didn't plan to, but because there is a specific exhaustion. When you've held the thing together through sheer force of intention, and the intention is finally allowed to unclench for a moment. He sat down on the step below her. He didn't say anything. He let the quiet do what it needed to do. She thought with the part of her mind that was always observing that this was the right instinct exactly. She lifted her face after a few minutes. "Do you think they actually go to Santa Fe? Lindell will go back to Cutter. He'll report. Cutter will spend the next several days calculating whether the federal angle is real and how much uncertainty he's willing to carry. And in those days, the letter is on its way. If it goes right, the marshal is in the saddle inside a week. In the meantime, Cutter knows something he doesn't fully understand has come into play, and men like Cutter don't operate well with incomplete information. You've been doing this a long time." He didn't answer that. After a moment, he looked at the south road, empty now, except for dust settling in the cold afternoon air. "Tell me about the last thing in the tin box, other than the deed." She had not mentioned the other thing in the tin box. She looked at him, unsurprised by this small surprise, and went inside and came back out with a folded piece of paper, a letter in Daniel's handwriting dated 3 weeks before his death, addressed to the U.S. Marshal's office in Santa Fe. Daniel had been drafting a complaint of his own. He had documented the tax assessment, the water rights rejection, the departure of the hired hands, his 2 visits to Pruitt, and his suspicion that Elias Cutter intended to manufacture a legal pretext for property seizure. Daniel had never sent it. She handed it to Cade, who read it carefully, and when he looked up, his face had gone somewhere she hadn't seen it go before. He knew. He knew what Cutter was doing, and he knew nobody would help him. He was building a record in case something happened. Cade looked at the letter for a long moment. He was a careful man, yes. Ruth's voice was quiet. The 2 of them were quiet together for a moment in the October afternoon. That letter goes with yours to Santa Fe. It's corroboration from the decedent himself. It will matter. She nodded. Cutter will come himself when the uncertainty gets to him enough. He'll bring Sims and Pruitt and make the legal argument about lawful custody. He will, and when he does, you have your own evidence. From Tucson, Martin Greer's death. The widow of Martin Greer filed a federal complaint 6 months ago. The case was pending a witness who could corroborate the money trail. I've given a deposition. It's already in the federal record. He looked at her. When the marshal's investigation begins and Cutter's Cimarron operation starts to unravel, the Tucson case becomes immediately relevant. He's exposed in 2 jurisdictions. Ruth looked at him steadily. You've been patient about this. 3 years. You rode into a public hanging in Cimarron, New Mexico, to cut a widow down off a scaffold because it was the right legal moment. He was quiet. What kind of man does that? He looked at the south road, at the horizon where the red clay met the afternoon sky, and there was something in his face that was neither pride nor regret, but the honest residue of both. The kind, he said, who was there the first time and stayed on the edge of it. She understood without asking that he meant Tucson, that he had been there when Martin Greer died and had not been in a position to stop it. She understood without asking that he had been carrying that. Elias Cutter came the next morning. He arrived in his private carriage with Halford Sims and Amos Pruitt and 2 men who were not quite deputies. The carriage stopped at the edge of the clearing, and Cutter stepped down with his hands clasped behind his back, walking toward the cabin with the air of a man arriving to make an offer. Cade met him in the clearing. The 2 men stood looking at each other, and Ruth, watching from the doorway, could see in the quality of that silence that this was not their first time standing at close range in contested territory. Cutter looked at him. I know who you are. Low. Just between the 2 of them. Then you know what I have. Cutter's jaw tightened. Evidence that can't be used in a New Mexico court. You're a wanted man in Arizona territory. The evidence belongs to the widow of Martin Greer. She is not a fugitive. She filed in federal court in Tucson 6 months ago, pending a corroborating witness for the money trail. That witness deposed last month. It's already in the federal record. A pause. Your Cimarron operation and your Tucson operation are about to be investigated simultaneously. Sims spoke from behind Cutter, his voice careful and professional. When exactly was this deposition? Last month, filed in the federal record. The date is available to you through proper channels. He looked at Sims. You know how to use proper channels. Sims looked at Cutter. The look that passed between them was the look of men who have planned a campaign and discovered an unanticipated terrain feature. Ruth stepped off the porch. She walked to Elias Cutter and stood close enough to see his face in full. She took the deed from her dress pocket. She held the deed where he could see it. 412 acres, certified in 1881. The property has not been legally transferred. The land office motion your lawyer filed was based on testimony you obtained through intimidation in a proceeding presided over by a judge who arrived on your arrangement. You had my husband killed for this. Cutter looked at her. For the first time she could remember, there was something in his expression that was not calculation or contempt or the performance of respectability. It was the look of a man who has built a long structure and can feel it beginning to shift at the foundation. You cannot prove that. Doak Lindell can when he decides what kind of arrangement the marshal offers him. She watched Cutter's face carefully. And Daniel left a letter. He was documenting what you were doing. 3 weeks before he died, he had written a complaint to the marshal's office. He just hadn't sent it yet. He was a careful man. He wrote everything down. Cutter was very still. Ruth turned to Sims. Leave my property, today and permanently. If any harm comes to me or to this land before the marshal arrives, the depositions already filed in Tucson will be supplemented by an affidavit describing this conversation. In full, you heard every word of that. He was a competent man who had been in this business long enough to understand when the terms of a situation had changed in ways that could not be negotiated back. He touched Cutter's arm. The October wind moved through the dry grass around them, bending it all in the same direction. Then he turned and walked back to his carriage, and Pruitt and Sims went with him, and the 2 hired men came behind, and the carriage turned on the road and went south. Ruth watched it go. The marshal arrived on Thursday. 2 of them, Senior Marshal Corvin Hatch and his deputy, Ellsworth. Hatch was 50, lean, with a closely trimmed beard, and the manner of someone whose professional competence has long since stopped needing to be demonstrated. He read both letters at the cabin table, Ruth's 4 pages and Daniel's unfinished draft complaint, and drank 2 cups of coffee and asked questions for nearly 2 hours. He spoke with Cade separately in the yard for the better part of an hour. By Friday evening, there was a warrant for Elias Cutter's arrest on 3 counts. Land fraud, conspiracy to commit murder. Doak Lindell was arrested Saturday morning at Cutter's mill, still showing up for work, a decision that suggested a significant misreading of the situation. He made a deal with Hatch that afternoon. The deal included a detailed account of the night of Daniel Calloway's death, which Hatch recorded in full, which would eventually produce a 4th count against Cutter. Halford Sims provided a voluntary statement. A competent man, as Ruth had observed, who knew when to read a room. His statement placed Cutter at the center of 3 separate land acquisition schemes over 6 years. Burl Fitch and the 3 hired men left the county before the warrant was served and did not return. Amos Pruitt resigned as sheriff on Saturday afternoon, a few hours after Cutter's arrest. He was not prosecuted, which was the kind of outcome that required Ruth to spend some time sitting with it before she could set it down and stop spending time on it. She spent Sunday walking her property. It was still good land. It had been good land all along. That had been the point. That was always the point. That was why they had come here, and why Daniel had worked every hour of daylight on it, and why Cutter had wanted it badly enough to do what he'd done. She walked the south fence line and the creek bank where she had found Daniel, and she stayed at the creek for a while, and then she walked up the slope above the house where the grass grew thick, and the seep she had found in her second summer. She thought about Daniel. She thought about what he would have done with Tuesday morning ahead of him and the land secure. She thought he would have replaced the broken corner post on the north fence line. He would have gotten the winter wheat in the ground, weeks late, but still possible if the cold held off. He would have sat at the kitchen table in the evening with a cup of coffee and made a list of what came next, and the list would have been orderly and specific and written in his careful hand. She went to the kitchen table and started her own list. Cade had his horse saddled when she came back outside. She had half expected this. She stood on the porch and looked at him, and he looked at her, and they had both understood since roughly the first morning that this was the shape of it, work to be done here that had nothing to do with him. Tucson. He nodded. Martin Greer's widow. She's been waiting 3 years for the federal case to have enough traction to move. It has that now. He settled his hat. Hatch will want a deposition. I need to be in Santa Fe by the end of the month. Ruth came down off the porch steps. She held out her hand. He looked at it for a moment, this woman in a worn dress with her wrists still bearing the marks of the rope, standing straight on the land she had fought for and was going to keep, and he shook it. The north fence needs work, I noticed. I'll have it done before the first snow. He nodded. He looked at the house, at the land, at the October sky lying flat and pale above the mesa to the west. You'll be all right? Not a question. I was always going to be all right. I just needed someone to cut the rope first. He mounted the gray horse. She stood in the yard and watched him ride south on the same road he'd ridden in on, and she watched until he was a shape against the horizon, and then a small cloud of red dust. And then nothing at all. The wind came through the dry grass. The creek ran quiet behind the house. The sky was the hard blue of a good October afternoon, and the land stretched away from her on all sides, the land she and Daniel had bought and built and worked and nearly lost, and it was hers. She went inside. There was a list to make. I have been old for a good while now, partner, and I have sat in a great many doorways in the late afternoon watching the light change and thinking about what the years have taught me and what they haven't. Here is what I know. Courage is not the absence of fear. A woman who stood on a scaffold with a rope near her neck and held herself steady and didn't beg, who leveled a rifle at 5 men and told the truth with her voice flat and even. Any person would be what she wasn't, was conquered by it. Fear is just a message. You read it and you go back to work. And here is something else. The men who build systems of cruelty, the Cutters of the world, the ones who wrap violence in paperwork and lease the law out to their purposes and call the whole business commerce, they rely on the people around them choosing quiet. They count on the crowd not moving. They count on the George Finneys of the world holding the lever, because that is what they have always done, because nobody has stood in the morning and said 2 words in a voice that left no room for argument. Sometimes all it takes is one person, and sometimes the woman on the platform was never going to fall, regardless, not because someone was coming to cut her down, but because she had already decided, in 4 days in a jail cell, that if she fell, it would not be from weakness. That is Ruth Calloway. That is the story of the man they called Cade, the man with no particular name that any town would keep, who spent 3 years carrying a patient reckoning across the territory in his saddlebag, waiting for the right thread to pull. He is somewhere out there still, South Road, somewhere between here and Tucson. He will not look back. He never does. The real story is hers. Keep your powder dry, friends. This story contains fictional elements created with the assistance of artificial intelligence. The characters, specific events, and dialogue are works of imagination, though the spirit of the frontier, the courage of ordinary people facing extraordinary circumstances, belongs to the history of the American West. If this story found you tonight, leave a number 1 in the comments and tell me where you're watching from. Like and subscribe, and I will be right here with another tale when you come back.